Well, let me offer an official welcome to everybody on the call this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to join us for what we know is going to be a very important discussion around a very pressing issue. Migrants coming to our country. I want to start with one housekeeping note. I am recording this session because we have a few folks that aren't going to be able to join us. And of course, the speakers are also interested in recording their prepared remarks for distribution within their own networks as well. So please make note of that. Well, we are in many ways coming from around the world this evening, certainly from around the Baltimore metro region, but representing many, many ethnic groups and ethnic heritage and immigration stories. So my name is Nora Collins. I'm the Regional Director of IVC here in Baltimore. On behalf of my colleagues and IVC volunteers, especially Elaine Ireland, Elaine Crawford, and Mark Wong and Chris Tucker, who helped plan this evening, we are really just so glad you're here, so welcome. Before I outline the goals and flow of our evening together and introduce our wonderful speakers, let me say a quick word about IVC because I see a number of new faces here tonight. IVC was actually founded here in Baltimore 25 years ago, and now the Ignatian Volunteer Corps has programs across the country in about 22 regions. Here in Baltimore, we partner with 30 fabulous, really wonderful partner agencies, 5 of whom work primarily on issues of migration. And that includes Asylee Women Enterprise, Immigration Outreach Services Center, from which 2 of our speakers are coming. Fern, and we have the directors here tonight, Laura and Mike are joining us from Fern, Esperanza and Catholic Relief Services. And so at all of those partner agencies, we currently have Ignatian volunteers and are privileged to be accompanying you in your good work. And so we are thrilled by these partnerships. We're grateful for them, and we're delighted you're joining us here tonight for this important discussion. Tonight, Tiffany, Pat, and Sister Mary Alice have the enormous task of answering a few questions for us. We're curious. First, why are people all over the globe on the move? And indeed, why are they coming to the US? Why do we welcome them? And finally, what can we do to help? So we will close the evening with some suggestions for advocacy and engagement, particularly with these wonderful nonprofits. By way of introduction also, just an important statistic to help frame the overall discussion. Today, our planet houses 79.5 million forcibly displaced persons from natural and man-made disasters. That's almost 80 million people. They are on the move. And some of them are coming here to the US, perhaps not enough. And they're seeking to make a better life also here in Baltimore. Baltimore has an incredibly rich immigration history. In fact, just a mile from my own home here down in Riverside, Locust Point was at one point the 3rd largest port of entry for migrants during the great wave of European migrants to this country. And so the additional question our speakers are going to answer tonight is how can we continue to be a place of welcome, especially another statistic, by 2100, so 80 years from now, 2 billion people, about 1/5 of the world's population, could become climate change refugees due to rising sea levels alone, 1 in 5. And that's coming from Cornell University. So we need to certainly understand these issues and certainly become a place of welcome as a nation and as a region. So a few housekeeping tips, because we're all used to Zoom, but we still can be reminded, right? Along the way, we are not going to be asking questions of our 3 speakers, but rather enter them into the chat. And we're going to have a huge chunk of time at the end of their presentation where Elaine Ireland, my colleague, will moderate this Q&A. So anytime you think of a question, throw it into the chat. We will not answer it right away, but rather at the end. Let me also recommend, so you are not watching your listening face, to go to the upper right-hand corner, hit view, and change it to speaker view. And that will allow you to really focus on the faces of the speakers and not your own face and the other faces that are on today. And really critically, because this is Theology Uncorked and we care about what this means for us as people of faith, between each of the presenters, we'll have a slide that will appear, and we invite you to reflect on the quotes that are present on that slide and to think what we might be called to. Again, it'll be a brief interlude between the speakers, and it'll last just a minute or two, and then we'll transition to the next speaker. Okay, those are the housekeeping tips. And as always, we begin in prayer. So let me invite an Ignatian volunteer, Mark Wong, to start us in prayer before I formally introduce the speakers and their bios.
Thank you, Nora, and good evening. Let us pray. God of love, compassion, and tenderness, today you call us to welcome all members of your family who come to our land to escape oppression, poverty, violence, and war, and to welcome them with joy and generosity. We recognize that in our city and nation, we come from different countries and have origins in different cultures, and that we all share an inalienable dignity that is deserving of respect. Yet, like the disciples, we too are filled with fear and doubt and even suspicion. We build barriers in our hearts and in our minds. Help us by your grace and love to banish fear from our hearts, that we may embrace your children as our own brothers and sisters, to welcome migrants, refugees, asylees, and immigrants with joy and generosity while responding to their many needs, to realize that you call all people to your holy family to learn the ways of peace and justice, to share our abundance as you spread a banquet before us, and to give witness to your love for all people as we celebrate the hope and many gifts they bring. Amen.
Amen.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Mark.
You're
All
welcome.
right. A very quick introduction to our speakers. Again, they'll present somewhere between 25 minutes to a half hour, and then we have a big chunk for Q&A. So again, please along the way enter your questions. First up, we have the wonderful Tiffany Nelms from Asylee Women Enterprise. She has a master's of social work from the University of Maryland, playing for the home team, and has worked with asylum seekers, forced immigrants, and survivors of torture for almost 20 years. Prior to joining AWE, Tiffany was the Associate Director of Children's Services at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants.
I didn't realize the time.
And Tiffany is a licensed social worker and at the helm of Asylee Women Enterprises.
Masters of
Welcome,
Marital.
Tiffany. Next, after Tiffany, we have Pat Jones from Immigration Outreach Service Center. Pat has more than 20 years of experience in development and management of research projects at Johns Hopkins and beyond. She has a master's degree in adulthood and aging studies. So you're in good company here. She's a registered nurse and a retired nursing home administrator. After retirement in 2010, Pat continued culturally aware and sensitivity training with families through the Immigration Outreach Service Center. Now, as director, Pat has served as an advocate for refugees, political asylum seekers, and immigrants. She has led IOSC in the development of new programs and the community organizing of local immigrant communities to build power in order to take action on important issues that affect immigrants in the Baltimore area and region. Thank you, Pat, for your many years of work. And finally, we're going to hear from Sister Mary Alice McCabe. She is a sister of Notre Dame de Namur, who has been living and working in Latin America during the last 35 years, 5 years in Nicaragua and 30 years in Brazil. Returning to the US in 2017, I'm sure it still feels like yesterday, she began volunteer work with the Central American immigrant population in Baltimore, and later, and most recently, at the Texas-Mexico border with refugee families fleeing violence and hunger in countries Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We welcome all three of our presenters and are so grateful. Tiffany.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you all tonight. I am going to try to be succinct. I'm Tiffany with Asylee Women. We also call ourselves AWE, A-W-E. And we've been around for about 11 years working primarily with asylum seekers in Baltimore. I'll just start with a very brief explanation of the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee. And so asylum seekers and refugees are fleeing persecution. Given the number 70+ million people that are displaced around the world, it's very unlikely that someone will be resettled to a safe country as a refugee. And the persecution is based on their race, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, and some other factors. So if they can get to a safe country like the US, our law allows them to apply for asylum, even if they, whether they arrive here without permission or whether they come on a visa, some kind of other visa, and then request the opportunity to pursue asylum. The difference is that refugees, when they are resettled, they're received at an airport by a refugee resettlement agency. They have a home waiting for them. They have a caseworker. They have a work permit. They're eligible for benefits to help them kind of get settled. The refugee resettlement program is not perfect, but at least there's that basic safety net. And asylum seekers, they start the asylum process once they're here in the US. They're not eligible for a work permit in the beginning stages of their asylum case. They're not eligible for any public assistance, including children. So if you have a 4 or 5-year-old child seeking asylum, they're not eligible for medical assistance. They can't get SNAP or what you may know as food stamps. There's no housing voucher or daycare voucher, and their parent likely cannot get a work authorization. For most of the people we work with don't get a work authorization until a year or more after their arrival. And since many of them have fled, often on short notice from their country, you imagine you show up with, what you can carry in a bag, and how do you support yourself when you have no access to resources? And it's also your responsibility to find yourself an attorney. So many of the local nonprofits that provide legal services do wonderful work. But like the rest of us are short on resources, and there are many more people who need attorneys than they have capacity to serve. So then this person who's fled persecution is left to present their case alone next to highly trained government attorneys or asylum officers. And to secure private representation is often, in the thousands up to $10,000. So, it's a very difficult set of circumstances that asylum seekers are faced with, and that's why we exist. And we do primarily focus on asylum seekers. Refugees are welcome at our day program, but our other housing, case management, financial support, material support, we really reserve that for asylum seekers for that reason. We're a fairly small team, and we do what we do. Last year, we served about 2,300 people, and we have a wonderful team of volunteers that helps us provide classes and accompany clients. Certainly things during the pandemic look a little different. But last week, our office is closed to clients in person right now. But a few weeks ago, it was kind of like, okay, this is who we are. And this is prior to COVID, kind of what we were dealing with on a regular basis. We had a woman who showed up at our office with her young child. I mean, she was disheveled, dirty clothes. She had a few personal items in a trash bag. And she is from the Congo, and she had fled. She was a nurse and had been persecuted because of her political activism. And so she fled. She did the route that, a lot of our Central Americans do. So she flew to she flew to South America and then she came up through Central America through Mexico. But unfortunately for her, she got stopped in Panama in this makeshift camp because COVID had really exploded then. And so they stayed there for months in a country where they didn't understand the language. They had no access to healthcare. Churches and nonprofits that were providing humanitarian assistance met their basic needs. But when things opened back up, then they traveled the rest of the way to the US border. And just kind of, I'm sure the speaker who's coming after us will talk more about the border, but because of some of the policies of the previous administration, people who have survived trauma and often torture in their own countries to then be traumatized on their journey to the US, and then by our own policies, which in the last few years, there were thousands of asylum seekers that were actually made to wait on the Mexican side of the US border. Instead of being allowed to pursue their case from inside the US, they were stuck in these makeshift humanitarian camps, which you've probably seen. So she went through all of that with a 6-year-old child, showed up on our door. We do provide housing, but of course there's always more need than we have resources. She had become pregnant against her will on the journey. And so we were able to mobilize pretty quickly, get her placed into our housing program with 2 other women from her country. And it just was a reminder. We've been kind of in COVID mode, our pantry has really scaled its operations to meet that basic need. But a reminder to kind of who we are and what we do, that we provide this holistic service, because how do you successfully pursue your immigration case if you don't have food to eat and you have unmet medical needs and you don't know how to get an attorney? Those holistic services are really, really important. And while a lot of services also happen out of our office, that camaraderie that comes with being in a place on a regular basis with other women who have a shared experience, understand what it's like, what you've been through. And so women who arrive alone, pregnant, with children, suddenly find themselves with women who feel like family. And that's a really important component of our program. So I'm happy to say that she's now, she's getting prenatal care. The child has seen the doctor. The child and her are both receiving counseling, even though they've only been with us less than a month. We're working on finding an attorney for them. And just the difference, if you can imagine going through all of that, that trauma for more than a year, having a good night's sleep, having a shower, having clean water, she looks like a completely different person. You almost wouldn't recognize her if you saw the before and after. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. There's a huge need in Baltimore. There's something like 40 to 50,000 pending cases in the immigration court. And there are very few providers. I know Nora said 5 of us here on this call, but resources are limited. So we really rely on and appreciate volunteers. Some of you on this call either volunteer for us now or have in the past. And we'd be happy to talk if you're interested in learning more. So thanks, Nora.
Thank you, Tiffany. We have some quotes for you to consider. We affirm that seeking asylum is not a crime. We urge all governments to abide by international law that protect those seeking safe haven. As Christians, we must answer the call to act with compassion. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. She didn't come for a better life. She came to save her life. Take a minute to personally reflect on what spoke to you as you listened to Tiffany and as you listened to these quotes. Now we welcome Pat Jones from the Immigration Outreach Service Center.
Elaine, thank you so very much. It was a wonderful interlude, moments to take and process what we've just heard, and I thank you for that opportunity. I would like to start with something I heard last week. I heard Cornel West speak this week on a news program. He's professor emeritus at Princeton. He's been on the faculty of Harvard Divinity School and now associated with Union Theological Seminary. On this particular show, he was talking about justice, particularly after the judgment in Derek Chauvin's trial, but also about Howard University's decision to close the Classics Studies department. He talked about his mother who recently died and her influence on his understanding of the words truth, beauty, justice, and love. We've all heard that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, but how do we define justice? Well, Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public. And as Tiffany so stated so well, this flies in the face of our previous administration, which split everyone into us and them. Using this dualistic rhetoric, our former president decreased refugee admissions almost to zero and attempted to build a wall to prevent immigrants from crossing the southern border. So Tiffany has just told us a compelling story about an asylum seeker. And I will tell you about a refugee family that we've helped off and on for more than 7 years. And I just want to reaffirm what Tiffany says. An asylum seeker is someone who leaves their home, travels to another country, seeks refuge in that country, stating that they fear to return home. And again, a lot of the reasons are persecution of some sort. And well stated, Tiffany. Thank you very much for that. So, and the asylum seeker, and this is the great catch, the asylum seeker spends their own money to get here and has to support themselves until they can get work, until they can get authorization papers. And that's often for us, I've seen a lot of people 6 months, but in the recent administration, the past administration, a year or more. And then they have to support themselves until they can arrange and pay legal fees, get their interview, and hopefully the positive result of being welcomed into the US. In the past, we've had people who've taken 5 years. I know of people who've taken even longer. A refugee, on the other hand, seeks status as a refugee before coming to the US. They go to the UN, the High Commission on Refugees, and they complete detailed paperwork and are vetted prior to arrival. Once they are approved, they are resettled by agencies, as Tiffany so well mentioned, that receive grant funding to provide housing, jobs, health insurance, and other support services until they're independent. Unfortunately, until their independence sometimes varies a great deal. And so that's how we often wind up in the mix. And being a refugee sounds wonderful. Most families, mom and dad, should be able to support themselves, don't you think? Feed the family and make sure the kids are educated, etc. That's one of the questions and one of the stories I will tell you. But why are they coming? That was one of the questions asked at the beginning. Pope Francis in Laudato Si talks about migration globally as going from south to north. And it's in response, as we know, those coming for asylum may have been persecuted. People coming as refugees may have been forced from their homes because of ecological disasters, also religious persecution, war, poverty, but also diminished water reserves and failure of the agricultural system. And also now weather, the terrible weather experiences we're having. So this is why they're coming. But here are the challenges of migration. And this is, Tiffany and I, we kind of balance one another, because a lot of these challenges are for asylum seekers and refugees. The way in which they access services may be different. But first of all, it's the person we've been helping for like the last 7 years or more arrived in 2012. Language was a huge issue for her. She was in ESOL classes 4 days per week at a school or university. And of course, that's not so now. We can't go off to the schools and universities, but that's another story. They are offered jobs, but they have to take the first job they are offered, which might be a very difficult job, cutting chicken in a refrigerated room. We can go down the list of all the jobs that are out there. And housing in Baltimore is relatively expensive when you compare it with the middle portion of the country. Baltimore is not cheap. And when you're making an average back in 2012 of $7 to $10 per hour, you'd have a great difficult time supporting the family. $7 to $10 an hour would at the most be about $300 take home a week. That's about $1,200 a month. And with rent at $900,000, it's almost undoable. So you can see the best scenario for resettlement is a dual parent arrangement. So how then does a single parent survive? And that's the story we're going to get to. They've got to get the kids in school. They've got to put food on the table. They have to learn the language, and they have to work to pay the rent. So let me tell you an almost impossible refugee story that resulted in a lot of successes. Let me tell you about Joy. Elaine, don't be upset. I changed the names. But even though Joy gave us permission to show her pictures, but I just didn't want to throw all the names out there. But Joy and her family are from South Sudan originally. She was born and spent most of her life before coming to the USA in a refugee camp in Uganda. She tried to go home to Sudan, but the situation was so dangerous because of the war and the persecution. She returned to Uganda, and all of her children were born in the Uganda refugee camp. The oldest, Rollo, was very ill, and his health may have been one reason she was granted refugee status. Joy, Rollo, Jeannie, Paco, and Ella came to Baltimore in July of 2012, sponsored by the IRC. Rollo was in high school, Jeannie in middle school, Paco in elementary school, and when they first arrived, Ella was 4 years old. They spoke their tribal language, not Arabic, not Acholi, not Swahili, a very little-known dialect called Madi. Early in 2013, Joy, Jeannie, Paco, and Ella started coming to tutoring on Saturdays at the IOSC. Joy was functionally illiterate. She was going to ESOL classes at BCCC. At tutoring, one of our retired primary school teachers worked with Joy and Ella. They were sitting next to each other, working alongside one another, mother and child, learning English. It was an amazing, amazing picture. Ella helped her mother with shopping. They would go through the pictures of all of the market, the aisles of the market. And Ella eventually got to the point of telling Mom, we need this, we need that. And Mom learned quickly how to calculate the unit cost of food and get the best deals. So although she was illiterate, she was a smart lady with her money. The 3 younger children were baptized at St. Matthew, which many of you may know is where the IOSC is based. And IOSC's involvement with the family was not only tutoring, but pastoral, case management, and assistance with healthcare management. As Joy's help from the resettlement agency gradually decreased and grant funding ran out, the IOSC helped her stay in compliance with social service benefits. When she first came, she had temporary cash assistance, food stamps, and health insurance. that was all provided. And you know, it sounds wonderful, but understanding the process of redetermination, the hoops you have to jump through every 6 months became quite a challenge.
Can I have my iPod so I can make the trade?
Initially, she could not work because Ella was not in school and Joy was attending her ESOL classes. Every 6 months, Joy had to supply all of her paperwork since she wasn't working, showing she was going to ESOL. She was volunteering to help it and understand and adjust to life in the US. After Ella started school, Joy, not the resettlement agency, Joy found herself a job at Laundry City, around the corner from her apartment. Once that happened, she no longer needed temporary cash assistance. After Rollo graduated from high school and got a job, she no longer qualified for food stamps. And so little by little, step by step, she became totally independent. She's a valued employee at Laundry City. She has the keys. She opens up and closes on a regular basis. She's in a trusted role at the laundromat. So far, the IOSC has seen 2 of the children get their citizenship. Rollo in 2018 and Jeannie in 2020 are now US citizens. Unfortunately, Joyce was not able to pass the reading and writing part of the citizenship test, but we hope that some other venue will open up for her to get her citizenship in the future, now that it seems things are becoming more positive. Jeannie is finishing her 2nd year at CCBC. Paco is a sophomore at Baltimore City College High School, and they have already far surpassed their Ugandan experiences, and we hope they'll meet their fondest dreams. Their illiterate mom has financially supported them, taken on a trusted role at her job, and kept 4 kids fed and educated and healthy on $7 to $10, gradually rising to about $13 an hour. I personally don't know that I could do it. What do you think? $300 per week, food, rent, clothes, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. I have to tell you from my perspective, and I think Elaine will agree with me, there is no greater story than that. Maybe I'm a little biased, but there is no greater story than seeing this woman come to this country and establish a life for herself with a lot of support, yes, but establishing a life for herself, even though she is illiterate and had to struggle and had great difficulties. So if you think that immigrants should be limited, stopped, deported, let me again remind you of that quote that I opened with by Cornel West about justice. Justice is what love looks like in public, and may we never forget that. And if we go no further than the first principle of Catholic social justice teaching, we see the commitment to life and dignity of the human person. The Catholic Church proclaims that human life is sacred and that the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. This belief is the foundation of all the principles of our social justice teaching. Catholic teaching also calls on us to work to avoid war. Nations must protect the right to life by finding increasingly effective ways to prevent conflicts and resolve them by peaceful means, which I think means migration for the vulnerable, like Joy, is very necessary. And that's what brought her here. We believe that every person is precious, that people are more important than things, and that the measure of every institution is whether it threatens or enhances the life and dignity of the human person. And Tiffany, what a great story of how you have upheld the life and dignity of your young woman from Congo. And I think this story about Joy sort of tells her story as well. So great, great story for us. Thank you all very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Pat. And we have some more quotes for you to consider. There has been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection. Our lack of response points to the loss of that sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all civil society is founded.
And so this is Joy and her family. The oldest son up on the right is now graduated from high school and has a job. The oldest daughter on the right next to mom is in her second year at CCBC. The next boy up on the left of my screen is in his second year at City College High School. Very commendable position to be in. And the youngest, Ella, is the mayor of her neighborhood. She's the personality of the local community. And this kid is going to go places, I assure you. Organizing or politics, I don't know which. That's the family. Thank you so much, Elaine, for that picture.
No one puts their children in a boat unless water is safer than land. And now we welcome Sister Mary Alice to share her experience at the border.
Oh, Sister Mary Alice, you're muted.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see your faces and know we're all literally on the same page here. And thanks so much to Pat and Tiffany for such inspiring stories. My story is of the border and what's been happening in the last 2 years there, 3 years actually. During the years 2018 and 2019, 35 of our Sisters of Notre Dame, along with many other volunteers from around the United States, helped welcome immigrant families, asylum seekers from Central America who were arriving at the southern border, fleeing their countries to escape violence, poverty, and environmental disasters. We heard stories of their children being kidnapped, their teenage boys forced into gangs. Droughts had destroyed their lands and their crops. We're talking about Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador specifically. When they would reach the US border, it was after months of suffering on the road through Mexico, which was another traumatic experience. Most had suffered extortion from smugglers who charge thousands of dollars. I think one of you mentioned how expensive it is to come to ask for asylum in the United States. They have to borrow money to get here, and they're paying it for many, many years, paying it back. Many had been kidnapped and raped during their trips through Mexico. By the time they arrived at the border, they were scared, traumatized, hungry, dirty, weak. When Border Patrol brought them to the shelters on the United States side, and we worked in a shelter called the Humanitarian Respite Center of Catholic Charities in McAllen, Texas. That's where we volunteered. The shelter would provide a warm welcome, safety, clean food, whatever they needed, and contact with their sponsor family and preparation for travel to their destination in the United States. Everyone arrives with a telephone number so that they can contact a sponsor. People don't know that. They all come with a telephone number, all of them, 100%. They were treated with dignity at the shelter. There were days, however, when we would be welcoming more than 500 asylum seekers at one time. The shelter was packed. That all ended in June of 2019, when the Trump administration said, no more. We don't want asylum seekers from Central America. Let's find ways to deter them, separate the kids from their parents, make them wait in Mexico, facing danger and kidnapping. That should force them to give up and go home. This, of course, humane, cruel deterrence, what they called MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols. Obviously, it was Migrant Prosecution Protocols, or remain in Mexico. 72,000 migrants were forced to wait in Mexico under the MPP policy. So what happened? The shelters then were empty from one day to the next. There were no more immigrant families arriving. 500 one day, 0 the next. Where were they? We found them on the Mexican side in the town of Matamoros, huddled together, waiting near the bridge, and there were thousands. Volunteers from all over the US began to mobilize and bring supplies, blankets, pup tents, diapers, food, mattresses. And the volunteers would go over the bridge every day, dragging carts filled with supplies. It became the Matamoros refugee camp, and it was a stone's throw over the bridge from Brownsville, Texas, United States of America. And it was filled with people willing to suffer and to wait for a promised court date that really would never materialize. It was a hoax. Conditions were deplorable in the camp. When we first arrived there were 6 toilets for a couple of thousand people. They had to take baths and drink out of a dirty, infested Rio Grande. The months dragged on. The beautiful thing that happened was we saw families in the camp begin to organize themselves into cleaning crews, sidewalk schools. They made ovens out of clay from the river. They made furniture from cardboard boxes. They shared among themselves. They built altars, and various religions organized prayer services. And there were volunteer health providers, doctors from all over the United States to help out. And there were even Cuban immigrant doctors in the camp who were part of the health team. And then the COVID hit, and the camp was closed to volunteers like us. The medical crew locked down the camp to protect the families from the COVID. And miraculously, none of the immigrants in the camp ever got serious COVID symptoms. There was a field hospital and it protected them. So there were miracles of care, compassion, gospel response were going on in spite of the former government's cruel treatment of desperate immigrants, asylum seekers. And in spite of all of these hardships, there was heat waves, cold waves, hurricanes, floods, but they never gave up hope. And the majority of them hung on for nearly 2 years, sitting in those tents. And during the pandemic, it even got worse because a hurricane came, a snowstorm, floods, vermin, and rats and other things because of the floods was all plaguing the camp. But they believed in our country as their only chance at life. It was certainly a vision of faith and a vision of hope. One of the interesting things is that I met several people that were on their way to Baltimore, and I would collect phone numbers. You know, somebody said, my destination is Baltimore. I said, give me your phone number and we'll talk when you get there. So I've had a collection of those over the years, over the last 2 years or so. And I've met some wonderful people, and their stories, I think, concretize who these people are and why they come. One of them is Lorena and her 13-year-old Carlos. They fled Honduras because he was targeted for recruitment into the gangs. And to refuse means death. And then they killed her husband. So she and Carlos left for the US border. And in Mexico, running from kidnappers, Lorena broke her leg. I asked her how she escaped and made it to the border. She said, my son carried me on his back. He was 13 years old. Here in Baltimore, they live now in Baltimore, and they've gotten help. She got help from Medicare, Union Memorial has been very good to help her get her leg back in shape, for which we're grateful. And Eva is a Guatemalan Mayan woman. And back in Guatemala, she had a relatively good, successful business selling tacos and tamales in the marketplace. But the gangs saw her success, so they targeted her to pay a tax. This is very common in these countries, an extortion of 50%. She refused to pay, so they beat her and they threatened to kidnap her little girl if she did not pay the next day. So she and the child fled that night. And when I met Eva, she was still traumatized. She was crying and shaking as she told me her story. But she had to flee to save her child. And now she lives in the state of Maryland, thank God. And there are many other stories of Guatemalans, Hondurans who've lost lands and homes in the last 2 consecutive hurricanes that hit them this past year. 9 million people have been displaced in Honduras and Guatemala. 9 million. That's in the past year. So we wonder where they're coming. They have to come. It's a choice for life. The present situation, on February 25th, the United States finally opened its doors to these suffering families, these asylum seekers, and 4,000 asylum seekers would leave that camp in well, not only the Matamoros camp, but other camps as well, and be processed out of MPP into the United States where they could present their claim for asylum within a year. So their hope at last was rewarded. However, even though 4,000 MPP asylum seekers during the last 2 months have crossed into the United States, there are another 27,000 still waiting on the Mexican border. Remember, Trump put 72,000 souls into MPP. And now many new arrivals at the border are being denied entry. Why? There's something called the Title 42. Title 42 is a public health policy invented by the Trump administration and used as a pretext for expelling asylum seekers as a health risk. And it's still being employed at the border against thousands as we speak. 65% of those asking asylum are expelled still. That's about 104,000 people. And the drastic result is that they are condemned to return to Mexico or to their country to face danger or death. So the right to asylum is still not a total reality at our southern border, even though by international and national law, the United States is bound to receive asylum seekers fleeing danger. I spent this past month of March at the border with Ellen, who's also here on our Zoom. The 2 of us were down there. And the shelters weren't nearly as full as they had been in 2018 and 19. Many more could be allowed to enter right now. And I have read that other shelters like in El Paso and other places are saying, hey, we've still got room. Where are they? Title 42 has to go. I think someone said, what should we do? Title 42 has to go. We really have to pressure for this. The high number of asylum seekers is not a humanitarian, is a humanitarian protection challenge. It's not a security challenge. Now, people will ask about the unaccompanied minors. The unaccompanied minors is a different situation. They do not come to the shelters. They have sent from Border Patrol straight to Health and Human Services and the Office of Refugee Settlement. There are tens of thousands. The great majority are mostly teenage boys fleeing the gangs back home, where there are no jobs, money, or education. There's no future, only gangs. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of Health and Human Services, is really doing an extraordinary job at trying to protect them, opening up many, many new centers and asking for volunteers to help. 85% of these young people, these minors, have relatives here in the United States awaiting them. But there has to be vetting, of course, because they could easily fall into the hand of traffickers. So there has to be that caution. Health and Human Services is calling for volunteers to help with this tremendously necessary task to protect this generation of youth from Central America. Catholic Charities has been asked to help with that. Just one last word. Given our country's shameful 100-year plus military intervention in Central America to defend US economic interests, one could argue that we have a responsibility to receive those fleeing from a situation that we have created over the last 100 years. We also bear responsibility for climate change that they suffer. Our carbon dioxide emissions are 700 times that which El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala together have emitted since 1990. We pollute and they suffer the consequences. And so they come to our border. And as the Bishop of El Paso, who's one of my favorite bishops, says, his name is Mark Seitz, the immigrants aren't a threat. They offer us a holy invitation to recognize our interconnectedness as a human family and to respond with compassion.
Thank you so much, Sister Mary Alice. And we have some more quotes for you to consider. Anyone who searches and struggles for justice in an unjust situation is working for the kingdom of God. We must change how we see immigrants. We know that they arrive at our borders seeking safety and a better life. They are not a threat. They offer us a holy invitation to recognize that we are connected as a human family and to respond with compassion. Immigrants are artists because they create a life, a future, from nothing but a dream. Now I'll turn it over to Elaine Ireland to consider your questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Righty, folks. There are not a whole heck of a lot of questions, but we'd like to get started and see if there's one for Sister Mary Alice. Are there any active public efforts, or at least at high government level, seeking to get rid of Title 42, or to at least defang it? As it said, what are the efforts administration or advocacy-wise in that?
All right. From what I've read, most of the protest is coming from the advocacy groups, and there are a lot of them. There have been letters to President Biden signed by, I think I counted 70 different religious organizations and non-governmental organizations. And this would have been one of the petitions, along with other things. Another one would be the refugee ban. So I don't think what you read is coming most out of the administration is the efforts of the vice president, who is doing diplomatic work with the Central American presidents. And there is a lot of effort, I think, to help the unaccompanied minors.
Mm-hmm.
what I think is happening is because there's so much effort at protecting the youth, they still see the Title 42 as an excuse for keeping out more asylum seekers and supposedly overwhelming the system, which is not really true, because the asylum seekers come in, they got to change their clothes, they get on a bus, they go to their relatives, and you never see them again, and they're off to work. They are not a problem. There is not a crisis. What we have to address is the fact that it's not a crisis at the border. It's a crisis in Latin America, in their countries, yes. And there's a crisis in our own government, and I think they're having a hard time catching up because Trump put things on hold for so long. But no, I don't think that there are any public efforts at seeking to get rid of Title 42.
Would that be like a congressional thing, or is it would that be a bill in Congress, or would it be, who's responsible for that, I guess?
I think it easily could be changed by an executive order.
Okay.
It was the White House that invented that.
Okay.
And it was the CDC. The CDC also invented it, and the CDC is still supporting it.
Okay.
Even though there is no proof that the immigrants are a health risk in terms of COVID.
Right.
There's really no proof of that. I think there's other people that are like Nora saying that you have information about that, maybe more.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, Nora?
Yes, thank you, Sister Mary Alice. We will, after this, maybe tomorrow morning, send out an email around the 3 advocacy asks, 2 of which you mentioned, including the Title 42. And it is through the CDC that we need to apply pressure, and specifically to our congressional offices, so they can kind of at the legislative level apply pressure to the executive level.
And Nora, there is a group that meets with the White House. It's an immigration group that, as far as I know, anyone can go to it. You just have to respond to the emails. But the Mark Hetfield was there from HIAS, and he was very negative about this 15,000 number of refugees. And I think what was happening is that the White House is kind of marking time because they don't know what direction to go in at the moment. There was a previous 15,000 refugees coming in. There's also the asylum seekers coming across the southern border. And I think they were a bit shaken by that. But after Mark Hetfield really called them to task on it, the Biden administration backed down, and within a day came out with a press release that we would start with 15,000 and go for more refugees. But I think we just need to go to this task force, go to this meeting and ask about Title 42 and see what's going to be done and how it's going to be approached. Because I think that's horrific. I mean, that's almost like Ellis Island and the tuberculosis wards that were on Ellis Island, that's awful.
That's that's a good example, a very good example.
We have a question for all 3 speakers, okay? And this is interesting. Who would you identify as your best and biggest role model when it comes to the important work that each of you perform? Who inspires you, I guess, is what the question is. Whose work, Oscar Romero, those kinds of things, but who would inspire you? Tiffany, do you have anyone that you can speak to?
I would say that, when you work with people that are making a new life here, I'm inspired by the people that we serve. And, I hate to always say, they're so resilient, because some people aren't. Some people are deeply, deeply traumatized. It doesn't mean that they can't overcome that, process it, and have a successful, happy life. Many of them do that. So I would say that that's kind of why I am motivated to do what I do, and particularly the women that are here with children. That motivates me.
Pat?
Yeah, I have to say I spent 2 years in the Living School, which is the program that is offered by Richard Rohr at the Center for Action and Contemplation. And during that program, we committed to contemplation on a daily basis. And then we committed to seeing how that might make a difference in the action that we take in the world. And as we worked our way through our 2 years, and I have to tell you, the 2 years were 2016 to 18. It was the worst 2 years as you can ever imagine in the world of immigration work. But the contemplative work grounded me in my work and my work ethic and everything that I do, so that when I went out to act, I was able to act in a way that a contemplative stance led me, and that I was able to come back to contemplation to then go back and to refresh myself to continue the work and to build that spiral up from action to contemplation. If I hadn't had that, I think I would have burned out a long time ago. And I think that's been the gift that's kept me going. If I had to say, Richard is a phenomenal person. I sit with him every morning at 10:30. We have a Zoom call and we all sit and pray together and meditate together. I would say that he wouldn't want me to say his name, but it's that whole belief in how contemplation feeds our action and our action feeds our contemplation.
That's a great advertisement for IVC, by the way.
There
Thank
you
you,
go.
Pat. We didn't pay for that. That is exactly what we do in IVC, is that we come together as a community to process together what we've experienced as we work with God's children and build ourselves up spiritually and emotionally and through camaraderie. So that's a great ad. Sister Mary Alice, how about you?
I would agree with Tiffany. There have been so many fantastic people, wonderful, wonderful people that I've met coming, the asylum seekers themselves, women, maybe particularly women. There have been so many wonderful women. Eva, the one I talked about, the Guatemalan Mayan, she was one of many indigenous that come from Guatemala. They don't even speak Spanish. And they come with their babies slung on their backs in a sling. And you see that they've come down out of the mountains. They are totally traumatized. They have no idea where they are. They know they have to keep moving forward. They know they have to keep moving forward. You see the determination in their faces, and they'll do anything for their children. So it's mothers that do all of this for their children. People are fighting for the future of their children. And it's a collective thing. It's just contagious. It's contagious. The courage is overwhelming.
Well, as that one quote we had from the very dramatic film Home by Warson Shire, you don't put your child in a boat unless the boat is safer than the land. That really struck me when I first heard that line. It's like, oh yeah, what would I do as a mother? So there's a big question that will be, and I'm conscious of time here. So there's a question about how things can be done to improve conditions in the countries of origin. That's probably maybe, if you have a quick answer to that, if any of you have a quick answer to that, but it's a huge topic. Ideally, I mean, the Dalai Lama said this. People jumped on him, but he said, no, you want people to stay in their homes. They want to stay where their ancestors are and their sacred lands and all of those kinds of things. What can we do to ensure that people can stay at home? Any thoughts? Again, that's a big topic, but
it's a big topic.
So, we do see some people return home after they've been here for a while, get themselves together, get a degree, get money together so that they can go home and be more self-sufficient. but it is a huge effort to deal with the ecological damage that's going on around the globe, particularly in south of the equator. And then, of course, there's always the difficulties around political motivations and war and all of the other things that are going on. I know the United Nations had a plan where they tried to facilitate helping people to stay. And I think that would be the ideal. You'd want to be where grandma's buried and where mom's buried and where family has been together for so long. But it's also an incredibly difficult situation. As Sister Mary Alice says, the gangs, the threats to families, we created that. And here we are complaining that people are coming to us and trying to save their lives. And the same thing's happening around the globe, that people are just suffering so much that they're taking the first chance that they can to get out. But hopefully in time, there's been a lot of work done by our own Governor Hogan with Kenya, trying to create global relationships and work situations that will empower Kenya in healthcare and various other ways, manufacturing and whatnot. I think we have to make serious efforts to improve the socioeconomic structure and the infrastructure in many of these countries. And that's how maybe we might be able to do that. It'd be nice to see more of a flow back and forth that would help all the economies around the globe.
And I would just add, for once people are here, people are either in the process of seeking asylum or they've been granted asylum. There's all this rhetoric about people that are undocumented, and asylum seekers are not undocumented. The government is aware that they're here, but regardless, by marginalizing people more and not providing access to support and community that people need to thrive, it only makes the situation worse. And if you think back to Los Angeles, the gang, the Latin American gang activity that really took off in the 70s and 80s was because of the racism and discrimination against Salvadoran refugees. And so, that community support, having a place for everyone to exist, is really critical. And we see how our families are impacted just here at the local level, like kids that are in 3rd or 4th grade that speak Arabic or speak Spanish in a school where everybody else speaks English, and the bullying from the kids, sometimes up to the staff, and comments about their immigration status. I mean, you can imagine the impact that has on a child over 2 decades.
Sister Mary Alice, did you have something to add, or?
There's a question about what do we think about the feasibility of the efforts at diplomacy led by Kamala Harris. I had a conversation the other day with an El Salvadoran family, and it seems that things in El Salvador are a tiny bit better. There has been progress. One of the reasons is that they are controlling the cell phones in the jails. That's what they're telling me, because a lot of what was going on with the gangs was from the side. And so they worked real hard on that, and they got financing for that, and they've controlled it. And if they can control that, they can control a lot. So that was one thing that they told me that I heard from people themselves, because I was fascinated with the fact that there are less El Salvadorans coming now and a lot more Hondurans and Guatemalans. That being, of course, because of the hurricanes, they have nothing left. One of the things that Kamala, I think she was speaking also to the El Salvadoran president, and he suggested make the temporary protective status, let them have permanent residence in the United States, because they work in the US and they send money back to their families. And that kind of a relationship back and forth is helpful. because then the families have some sustenance. And once they have that, the youth aren't dependent on the gangs in order to survive. The gangs exist because of poverty. They don't have any other choices. And the gangs know how to captivate them because they offer money. And if there were other alternatives, some of that would go away. So I think Kamala's into a few good things. It's got to, and El Salvador is figuring out a few steps forward.
I mean, there's a question about the gangs and what was the history and what created them. I mean, I think that's again a very big subject, but a lot of it is poverty, a lot of it is drugs, a lot of it I think has to do. I don't know personally the role that the United States could say that they had or we had in creating a gang mentality, but I think so much of what we suffer in in our city, everything else goes back to poverty and the lack of opportunity to make a decent living legally. So one of the things, if you're interested in learning about the gangs, obviously all of Greg Boyle's work with Homeboy Industries is just phenomenal, the work that they do in terms of getting people out of gangs. But there's a lot of, he does a lot in terms of some of his books about explaining how gangs came about and how people get roped into them and how it all works. So I think Tiffany is sharing some stuff. I'm hoping that I can, let's see. We're just going to recommend Father Greg's books. Good. I'm conscious of time. We're actually a minute over, and there's one final question, and it is actually a great segue into our next part, and that is, in the spirit of Mother Teresa, do small things with great love. What are a few tangible ways we can help now in terms of volunteering? And so, Nora, let's see. I'll turn it back over to Nora now.
Thank you. Ladies, I could sit at your feet for another half hour.
Great.
You have so much to teach us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you for being with us. We're going to close with a minute on this slide and then turn it back over to Mark Wong to end in prayer. That contemplation piece, so critical. So certainly, I'll include the majority of this in a follow-up email. Certainly, all of our partners that work with migrant populations could use non-perishable food, pantry items, diapers, cleaning supplies. So we can certainly organize at the parish level a drive for these organizations. Time and talent, teach English, become a volunteer, work with IVC through IVC and be part of our community of contemplation. And then of course, cash donations are so critical. So those unrestricted dollars that can be moved to in an emergency situation, these executive directors can make quick decisions to invest cash into families where it might be very critically needed at a last minute. So cash is sometimes one of our greatest helps. So all of their websites have examples of specifically what donations they need. The second category is advocacy. I will attach to my email to all of you precisely what Sister Mary Alice was talking about in terms of Title 42. There's also the GRACE Act requiring that the presidential directives for refugee cannot go below 125,000. That's gaining some momentum. In fact, I was on the call with 5 congressional offices the week before last, and there's some great momentum behind the GRACE Act to set that floor at 125,000. We all know it went down to 17,000 under Trump. So great, again, protecting refugee resettlement. And the final thing that Jesuit Refugee Services is asking for is support for funding for refugee education. So that's, and then I will also include some links to Catholic Relief Services that works on the push factors that we were talking about. Why are migrants coming? We certainly need to address poverty in these sending countries. So look for advocacy around both the pull factors and the push factors. And then finally, I'll forward to you another 2 wonderful webinars that were just produced recently on these issues. So if you want to continue your own personal education. So thank you. Expect that email. Mark, can you close us in prayer?
Thank you, Nora. What an extraordinary evening of sharing and reflection. Let us pray. God of love, tenderness, and compassion, may we always recognize your spirit in the refugee families seeking safety from violence and oppression, in the migrant workers bringing food to our tables, in the immigrant families seeking better opportunities, in the asylum seekers seeking justice for their families, in the unaccompanied child traveling alone in a dangerous world. Give us hearts that break open whenever our brothers and sisters turn to us. Give us hearts that no longer turn deaf to their voices in times of need. Give us eyes to recognize a moment for grace instead of a threat. Give us voices that fail to remain silent, but which decide instead to advocate prophetically. Give us hands and hearts that reach out in welcome, but also in work that responds to many needs and in reforms for a world of justice until all homelands are safe and secure. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Pat. Thank you, Sister Mary Alice. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you to both Elaines.
Thank you, Nora.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nora. This was wonderful. Really, really
Yeah.
nice.
I'm going to stop recording.